Thank you very much. Real pleasure to be with you all today, and fabulous to see what a great job BAWRD is doing in terms of looking at this issue, and I think particularly the amount of data and insight that's being used, which is very close to my heart. To introduce myself, so I'm Matthew Verity. I'm a worker in the UK at Kantar World Panel. So we're a continuous consumer panel that are essentially measuring actual behaviour of what consumers are doing, what retailers are doing, and working with a lot of the retailers and manufacturers over there. Three key things I want to cover today. First of all, the UK grocery market itself, so how is it performing? Then come on and think about, as we enter 2017, what's going on. And there's five kind of key themes, key topics I want to touch on, where we've seen a bit of a change, a bit of a tipping point going into 2017, so we can get some actual fact of what's going on. And then start to have a little bit of a think about Brexit and some of the potential implications. As a lot of you will know, the only real facts we have are uncertainty and inflation. There's very little other than that we know around that, but we'll start to look back a little bit and see what do we know and what can we garner from that. So our sales in terms of as a business, it's a panel of 30,000 shoppers, a continuous sample that are recording all of their food and drink purchasing that they bring back into the home. That's then weighted up, but essentially gives us a really good read of what consumers are actually doing, how they're behaving, and particularly with things like this, actually, how do they respond? And that's the data that's reported to the City of London in terms of the retailer shares, and to many of the manufacturers, many of you yourselves will be using the data. So in terms of the headlines of where the UK grocery market is right now, there's five key themes, I think, that I want to talk about. And a little bit more of a positive picture. So there's a bit of momentum, there's a bit of growth. There's quite strong performance coming through in the English market, and I won't lie to you, this is where I had to take the slide out with the victorious English rugby team just after Saturday evening. The first theme that comes through there, we're back in growth. So after a long period last year of deflation, a stagnant market, a market in decline, we've seen a real return to growth. Part of that has been driven by inflation. So if you look at just the last period, if we track grocery inflation, that has doubled in the last month versus the 12 weeks we were looking at the period before. And that's still quite modest, but clearly has a big impact on the performance of the market. You will know that Tesco is our major retailer, so almost 30% of the grocery market in the UK is held by Tesco. Clearly they've had a tough time. The Big Four itself has been quite squeezed in the UK. There's been a real revival of Tesco, and we continue to see that performance in 2017. Promotions is a huge theme within the UK market, and I'll talk a little bit more around this. If we look over the last kind of 9-10 years, we've seen a real upward trend in terms of the amount of volume, the amount of sales that go through on promotions, in some categories getting to almost unbearable levels. There's been a little bit of a pullback on promotions, and again, as we've entered into 2017, we've actually seen one of the sharpest falls in terms of the amount of sales that go through on promotion. And then the discounters, so less of a fundamental change, but we cannot get away in the UK from the huge growth we've seen from the discounters. That was starting to slow, still spectacular, but really starting to slow towards the end of last year. They've both come back with record share and again growing strongly and showing a bit of an upward trend, so we'll touch on that. So this is the UK grocery market, some facts and figures on it. Over there you've essentially got the share of the retailers hold of the UK grocery market, the change year on year. And then over here on the right-hand side, you can simply see the growth that each of those are seeing in the last 12 weeks versus this time a year ago. So I think two key points that come out here. Despite a lot of the trends we talk about, the big four retailers, Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's and Morrisons, still hold almost 70% of the market. So they're still massive, they're still really important. The right-hand side is where it's interesting. This is the first time in a long, long time we see all this green growth. So every single major retailer, apart from one, is in growth in the last 12 weeks. We expect to see Asda go into growth in the next period, so it'll be an unprecedented area where we're seeing all the retailers growing year on year in like-for-like sales. So on the face of it, quite a positive picture. If you look at just those big four retailers, so Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's and Morrisons, this just tracks their growth year on year, and you can see the steady improvement we've seen. So we'll come on and talk a little bit about Tesco, but Morrisons as a retailer, seeing a real upward change, and actually now the only one of the big four that have actually grown ahead of the market in the latest year, performing well. As I say, we can see the upward growth in terms of trend for Asda as well. So the big four really fighting back quite a lot in the UK. We also measure, as well as the growth of the market, actual grocery inflation. So this is not the UK inflation measure. This is taking almost 100,000 products on our panel and looking at the like-for-like change in prices. So it's the most accurate, robust measure you've got of actual price change in the UK grocery market. And you can see this tracked over time. And you can see recently, if we look at the last couple of years, we've been in a period of really slow growth, a market pushing into decline, and a real period of grocery deflation. So prices going down, price wars on top of that as well. Naturally, there's a lot of talk with Brexit about prices going up, the weakening pound. We expect to see a lot of inflation. We expect to see that increase. And we're certainly seeing that come through in the grocery market. So as I say, in just the last 4-week period, we've seen inflation in grocery double. So we're back again seeing positive inflation. It's a big increase. It's still modest inflation at this point. And I think the view out there is actually a bit of this inflation is quite positive and quite a good thing for the UK market. The key thing, and I think there's been a lot of reference to this morning, which is really important, is not everything happens at the same point. Not everything behaves the same way. There's very big differences in different categories. And if you just look at the top markets where we're seeing inflation come through, so again, that like-for-like change in prices, you can see butter, tea, fresh lamb, fruit, fish, some real staple markets there, seeing quite significant increase in prices. Yet on the other end of the spectrum, we're also seeing, if we look at those ones, some prices going down. So not every category is going to behave the same. Not every category is going to be impacted exactly the same in terms of inflation, deflation. So actually things like crisps, bacon, eggs, even fresh poultry have actually seen prices go down like for like in the last 12-week ending period. I spoke about the Big Four, and I just wanted to touch a little bit on Tesco. It's obviously such a big, important retailer in the UK market. This just looks at their overall value performance, 12-week year-on-year trended over the last, well, going back to 2013. And you can see, obviously, this period of Tesco's performance where they were up against it. That recovery started towards the end of last year, and we're starting to see that come through in 2017. A big retailer now that's seeing positive growth, slipped back slightly in terms of performance, but still seeing that positive growth on the 12-week ending period. So Tesco certainly continues that revival, which is a very different picture to what we've seen in the last couple of years. If we dig a little deeper in terms of what's going on there, if you break the Tesco estate down, so you've got their convenience offerings, you've got their main store, the real fight back has come from their big stores. So we as a business have spoken quite a lot for the last couple of years around the move away from the big supermarkets, the move away from the big stores, the growth of convenience, the growth of online. But actually, Tesco is very much recovering in its core supermarkets and Tesco Extra, so its hypermarket offering, and posting positive figures on that. So certainly seeing growth in large stores, and not just large stores, but obviously the main shop again, Tesco traditional territory performing well. Switching gains from some of the rest of the Big Four, so they were losing a lot of spend. So when we say switching, that's where people were moving their spend away from Tesco into other retailers. So getting some of that back. And then you'll all be very familiar, I think, with the farm brands. So Tesco's value own label offering, the launch of farm brands, has really driven their store performance. They've been very, very positive move on their own label front and offering a value tier in the own label market. I touched on promotions. This just looks at total grocery, saying what proportion of sales go through on deal in the UK market. And you can see we've seen a real pattern this going up and up and up. That has started to really come down. So the retailers have made a conscious effort to pull back on this, and particularly Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda have seen a real move away from the multi-buy promotional activity. So that's been very much driven by the Sainsbury's, who've completely removed all multi-buy promotional activity, moving more to the temporary price reduction mechanic, so simply a basic saving. And we've seen here the most significant drop in terms of a 12-week ending drop of how much goes through on promotion for a long, long time. So there's a real pullback on promotional activity. And you can just see here, we're just breaking out temporary price reductions and multi-buy activity, just the impact that multi-buy has there in terms of coming out. So that's very much driven by the pullback on the multi-buy activity. I mentioned the discounts. I just wanted to touch on these. So still a lot smaller in the UK than many parts of Europe. But if you just look at some of the facts and figures behind it, so if you go back to 2006, collectively Aldi and Lidl had a 3.8% share of the UK market. Sitting here today with our latest data that was released in February, almost 11% of the market. So phenomenal growth that the discounters have seen, and they continue to post record share, record growth month after month. So still a huge part of the market. That growth, as I said, starting to slow. and you can see it sort of coming down towards the end of last year, but actually we've seen a bit of an upward trend as we go into 2017, and actually Lidl now the fastest growing retailer in the UK and posting record shares. So still very spectacular growth. And increasingly, the discounters are offering very much an option that puts them in the mainstream, so behaving like the mainstream retailers, really fighting with the mainstream retailers in that main part of the market. So we just look here at the demographics here. We're just simply looking at what percentage of my spend comes from different social economic groups. So the Class A, B being the most affluent shoppers down to Class E. And you can actually see, compared to the market, where Aldi and Lidl sit. They are attracting that middle mainstream shopper. They're not just attracting a less affluent and older shopper. It's very much playing on the mainstream. They're also seeing 23% growth in their premium own label. So again, it's not just about having the value offering, the cheap offering. There's quality perceptions there that's so important now in the UK market, and there's a premium offering there that's driving that. And starting also to capture not just more shoppers, but actually can they get a bigger trip size? So can they get more and more people to do more of their shopping there, bigger baskets? So they're the kind of top-line headlines of what we're seeing. So a return to growth, a grocery market improving its performance, increasing inflation, which we expect to continue and continue upwards, a revival of Tesco and certainly the big four fighting back, a real pullback on promotions driven by retailers pulling back on the multi-buy activity particularly, and the discounters continuing to see strong performance and actually increase that rate of growth going into 2017. The second part, I just want to touch really on, obviously, why we're all here today in terms of what does some of this mean going forward, what do we know, what do we not know, and what are some of the implications that we can perhaps garner from this. So if we just come back to this chart, I think the one thing we do know, we're seeing inflation and we're going to continue to see inflation. So prices are going to go up, and we've seen here how much they've gone up in the recent period. That will continue. Predictions are around about 3-4% they will hit this year. So there's no doubt about it, although it's quite modest, we are in a game of inflation. That's the main fact we know. So we don't know very much at all about the process of what's going to happen, when the tariffs are going to come in, the subsidies the other way, etc. We do know we're in an inflation game. We've also got to bear in mind, I think this is where looking at some of the facts is so important, the UK grocery market is actually pretty inelastic. We still have to eat. We still have breakfast, lunch and dinner generally. And obviously this will vary by category, but actually we don't see that much change generally. And I think just to illustrate this, you hear a lot of talk about different markets about, oh, we're shopping a lot more frequently, we've got a much bigger repertoire of stores, we're getting smaller and smaller baskets because we're time poor and doing more convenient shops, and we're on different types of missions, so we're on top-up trips, for example. If you actually look at the last 5 years, there's been very, very little change in that. So actually, we're not shopping any more frequently than we used to. Our repertoire of stores, so the faces we visit in a 12-week ending period, have not changed at all in that time. Basket size, so the number of items we're putting in a basket, has changed very, very little. And the type of mission we're on, so here we're looking at the top-up mission essentially, so when you just go to the shop to essentially top up, hasn't changed a lot either, so there's a slight growth in that. But generally speaking, the grocery market, the volume is pretty stable, and it's quite hard to change some of these behaviours, so we don't just suddenly start behaving differently, although clearly we accept we're in very unprecedented times. So how can we cope with this inflation? What can we understand about it? I wanted to start, first of all, by actually looking back at when we last had big inflation. So that takes us back to 2008, the financial crisis, the UK recession. I absolutely take the point that we don't want to just look back, we're in a very different time. But I think also we've got to look at the only way we can put any fact on this is actually go, well, we know we're facing inflation. What happened last time we had big inflation? So this chart essentially just shows us the rate of inflation in black. So we can see this point here where it's going back up. And we can see right back here in 2008 when we had the financial crisis, the huge rate of inflation we saw when it was pushing up at 5%. If nothing else happened, the grocery market would simply grow at that black line, so we would just grow at the rate of inflation. What we're able to break down at Kantar is to essentially look at, well, how do shoppers cope with that? What are the metrics they do to essentially take their growth or even decline of markets down? So you can essentially buy into less volume in the green. You can down trade to cheaper stores in the blue. You can buy into more or less promotions in the yellow, or in the red, you can actually trade down to cheaper products. So we go right back over there when we had the high inflation. We saw people buying into more promotions, so that essentially helped them manage to spend a little bit, to manage that inflation. And then in that red period as well, we also saw trading down essentially, so buying into value-owned label, buying into cheaper products. And we can see again here, this yellow is above the line here. That's basically indicating that actually there's a promotional pullback, so people aren't saving money through promotions. They're doing quite the opposite. But there is that area of trading down. So already we are seeing a period of inflation, but actually shoppers starting to trade down a little bit. What's really important to note is back in 2008, a lot of that was also driven by the retailers. They were driving the own label agenda, driving the value-owned label agenda. And we've seen here with Tesco particularly, the farm brands, the value-owned label offering, again, driving their business, so having an impact there. But we are seeing, we look back a period of shoppers trading down effectively. And you can just see this illustrated. So this just goes up to 2008. What happens? This just breaks down the tiers we essentially see. So from a value offering to a premium offering and branded, the growth we saw during the last period of sizable inflation, huge growth experienced by the value-owned label offering. The other thing that we know is impacted is consumer confidence. Now, generally speaking, inflation will have a much bigger impact on grocery behaviour than GDP, consumer confidence, disposable income. Inflation is the key one that really changes behaviour. But consumer confidence obviously is interlinked and plays a role. And again, we're just looking back here at what actually happened previously. And two different examples here, which I think just illustrates different markets will behave differently. Different markets will have different challenges. So on the left-hand side, you've got mineral water, essentially a discretionary category, a non-essential, if you like. And just tracking the blue line of consumer confidence, and then the yellow is mineral water sales and consumption. And essentially, it mirrors it quite nicely. So when consumer confidence drops, sales of mineral water are really hit. The alternative to that is when we look at something like frozen fish, which sees the opposite impact, and again illustrates that there might be some genuine opportunities and benefits from this. So actually, when consumer confidence drops, sales of frozen fish actually went up. So actually, there's some categories that actually appeal to shoppers when they're faced with confidence, lower disposable income, higher inflation. They've actually got to manage their spend. There's also the opportunity to move into different categories. So there can be opportunities out there as well. I touched on this, and I think this is a really, really important point. We often look at, obviously, the whole of the UK performance, the UK economy, which is so important. But when you look at actually where does our spend as UK citizens go, food and drink has become a smaller and smaller part of that. So if we just focus on this bit here down at the bottom, apologies, my chart's gone slightly awry. That blue at the bottom essentially is a measure of the spend that goes on food and drink. It stayed pretty consistent. Actually, in the last recession when we saw high inflation, the percentage of our spend that went on food and drink actually went up. It's a huge increase that we see from utility bills and pressures elsewhere. Generally hits out-of-home consumption, going to restaurants and buying on the go, etc. And actually, we start to see in-home snacking in the grocery market can almost benefit and quite stable. So it's quite inelastic. We've still got to eat. And UK consumers aren't going to suddenly radically alter their behaviours from this, albeit it's the margin game that comes more of a challenge for manufacturers. Two other key trends that we see long term are the rise of health and then the rise of snacking in the UK. And again, during the recession, we saw health become less important. So that chart there just shows actually while health is a big upward trend and continues to be, when we're in hard times, when we're faced with rising prices and pressure, actually that goes out the window. We haven't got time to worry as much about health. Likewise, we start to treat ourselves a little bit. So it's not all about value and having the cheapest thing. Actually, in some of those hard times, we might eat out less, but we actually saw quite a surge in snacking and treats in the home as well. So again, there are potential opportunities that come through from that. So what can we garner just from looking back? So we look back the last period when we had high inflation. 5 things stand out, and yes, there's a danger of talking ourselves into recession here. All we're sort of saying is when there was high inflation, how did the grocery market, how did shoppers respond? The first thing is grocery market is pretty resolute, behaviour is pretty consistent, and volumes generally remain pretty stable. We saw a period of trading down, so shoppers managing that inflation by trading down to cheaper products. Discretionary categories were impacted, so there are absolute opportunities in some of the staple categories which actually surged a little bit, but discretionary, non-essential categories were impacted the most. As consumers, we tend to eat out less. This is the area that was much more impacted than the in-home grocery market. And it was all about really a slight pullback on health, but more treats in terms of some of the consumer behaviour. So how do we sort of put this together going forward in terms of what this means for the market going forward? I think without being too simplistic, there are very few knowns in this process. I think this morning's presentations have illustrated just what an unknown and long process we've got ahead of us. The only thing we really know is that there's going to be uncertainty. None of us really know exactly how it's going to be dealt with and managed. And we're going to see inflation. And I think we can only look at it from that, because at the moment, the economy is exceeding performance, expectations, GDP is in growth. There's nothing more we can do than continue what we're doing and obviously prepare, as you've seen this morning, for what might come. Some of the potential implications then. So the out-of-home market I've touched on, a £47 billion market in the UK, growing at 4.9%, so growing well ahead of the grocery take-home market. And a lot of that growth comes through areas like leisure, coffee shops, quick service restaurants. It's a real booming area and a long-term trend of more of us eating on the go, eating out of home, skipping breakfast, maybe eating that on the go. This is the area that is quite interesting, I think, because it's where we'd expect to see, and it's easier to manage your spend, so it's easier if you need to pull back on perhaps that coffee down the road than it is to manage your dinner at home. So the potential implication is this is an area that could face a bit of a slowdown, albeit in the context of an area that's in a long-term growth trend. Own label, the chart here just illustrates brands versus own label in terms of value growth over the last couple of years. Own label performing really well in the UK at the moment. Some of this is very much driven by the discounters that clearly have a big presence in own label and are performing very well. But even outside of that, we see own label growing ahead of the brands. And as mentioned, Tesco particularly driving their value own label offering. This shows no sign of slowing. Crucially also, it's a real differentiator for the big four retailers. So if you think of them at the moment in the UK, you've got four major retailers with 70% of the market fighting each other, with discounters at one end that are putting real pressure on with their own label offering. You've obviously got the growth at another end of M&S and Waitrose, the premium retailers. This is a real opportunity for retailers to really differentiate their offering. UK is a global leader in that. Growth is very robust at the moment. As I say, it's a key driver of different. It also drives store choice, so it's a reason to go to Tesco rather than Asda, or to go to Sainsbury's rather than Morrison's if you can connect with that own label. And it plays a real key pricing role as inflation bites. So it is a way that people can really manage that spend if inflation continues to rise. The other area the retailers are, I think, quite set on really is the round pound pricing. So this just tracks here in the blue the percentage of sales we go through a round pound, so a pure round pound price point. Something the retailers have put a lot of focus on and continue to do so, and you can see the importance of that. And you can just see here with this nice black line through the middle of it, the percentage of sales in those retailers that actually goes through at round pounds. This puts a lot of pressure as prices are going up. Actually, how do you keep them at the round pounds? Because I don't think the retailers will want this to go up sort of to £1.05p, £1.06p. So that automatically creates a pressure on actually, well, how do we keep it at round pound? And obviously the pushback goes to manufacturers. This will also, I think, put pressure on pack sizes and reformulation to try and keep the round pounds, but also keep the costs. You know, these retailers have been in a real price or a real competitive game where they don't want to push on loads of price rises. So I think pack size and reformulation could absolutely stay on the agenda. I spoke a little bit about the ways people manage inflation. I think, again, it's absolutely key. And I thought it was just worth pulling out last time what happened in some of the core categories. And I've just done this at a top-line level, but if you take the sectors of alcohol and ambient foods at a total category level, the main way that people managed inflation in those markets last time was by switching store choice. That was very different to the fresh and chilled area, where people are much less likely to switch store over the fresh and chilled thing, but actually they went down in terms of volumes. They reduced the volume they were buying of that market. And then when we look at the frozen sector, it's very much about product choice, so actually down trading to manage that spend. So I think this just illustrates that we have to look at different markets, different categories and different sectors within these markets in very different ways to see, well, how will shoppers cope? Because there's very big differences between them in the UK market. I think finally we expect the discounters to continue their surge of growth. They remain very well placed to increase their market share. Clearly a retailer that's not based in the EU, in the UK, and one that's got very, very ambitious actual store growth, so increasing their own estate. That's very much about increasing their coverage. Their game now is about how do they increase frequency, how do they increase the basket size, how do they tap into more missions, more categories. and starting to really behave like the mainstream retailers with different tiers. But we expect to see their growth continue and them to increase their market share, which again places pressure on the big four retailers as they offer that unique offering and steal spend from them. Coming back to the theme, I think, of specific categories, the other point I think to note is that, as I say, different categories will behave in different ways, have different components to them almost. And this just looks essentially, for some of our core categories, which ones overtrade with what we're calling our less affluent shopper, so our social class C2, DE shoppers, down to which ones overtrade. And this straight away pulls out some differences. So actually, if we look at kind of frozen meat, frozen poultry, prepared foods, etc., they're the categories that actually rely more on some of those lower social classes that are more likely to be having to actually act on some of that high inflation. When you get down to this end, you've got things like alcohol, savoury biscuits, etc., coming through. That's where they're less reliant on those shoppers, so perhaps less reliant on the shoppers that will really need to manage their inflation. Likewise, we talk about store choice. I can manage my spend by going to a cheaper store, going to the discounters. We've done exactly the same thing here, where we actually look at which sectors actually do the discounters overtrade in, so they're in a strong position and it's quite easy to go to those discounters and pick up those products, versus those where they've got a weaker situation. So you can see things like biscuits, frozen poultry, fruit and salad, fresh meat, etc. Areas where actually the discounters are overtrading, so there's a bigger risk there in terms of it's easier for me to downtrade my store choice. Clearly, when you get to areas like healthcare, pet care, oral care, etc., some of the non-food markets, it's much harder to sort of downtrade and move to discounters because the offering and reputation isn't there. So I think a couple of things really to leave you with to think about. Clearly, the impact depends on your category. It's important to think about that category. So how do shoppers actually cope with inflation in that market? Are there clear price tiers and own label presence that actually allow shoppers to trade down? You know, if there's not a clear price tier and there's not a big own label offering, then it's much, much harder to actually save money in those categories. Is there a clear market leader or a more level playing field? Do the hard discounters actually overtrade in that market? Do they offer a great opportunity to manage down with store choice? Are you more or less reliant on affluent shoppers who've more of a need to save? I think crucially, do you have a clear USP, strong equity that you will protect you from that competition? And just the final slide from me really today is just to think about, clearly these are unprecedented times, clearly these are hard times, a lot of us don't know what's going to happen, and we expect to see some real big margin squeezes. We mustn't lose sight of the UK consumer, what's been important to them and what's important to that market, and those long upward moving trends that we see in the market at the moment. So we are an older, more diverse nation. That in itself requires more. We're a nation of smaller households. The number of people now that will consume a meal on their own is a phenomenal amount, and we need to react to some of these trends. More and more people are living in one or two member households and often consuming on their own. We really value time. We are a time-poor nation at the moment. We need convenience. We need solutions. These are the sort of trends that we've got to continue to see. And yes, there's always a little bit of a pullback on health in tough times, but actually that is an upward trend with a lot of government pressure to keep improving the health agenda. Some of these long-term trends are exactly that. They're long-term trends that won't go. And whatever we do, the retailers cannot lose sight of the key trends and the consumer needs and making sure they are providing the quality that consumers want to see. And I think it's important that we recognise that as well as just the financial pressures that we're up against. Thank you very much.